This is Matthew, host of the Superhero Ethics Podcast, and I've got an ethical question for you. If I'm trying to help you not listen to ads, is it ethical for me to do an ad to help you do that? If you go to our website, theethicalpanda.com, and just click on the join button, for $5 a month, $55 a year, you get to hear all of our episodes without ads. Was I ethical in doing this? Let me know. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Friends, you've heard us talk a lot about anime, and as we've done that from time to time, we've talked about manga, the sort of the thing from which a lot of the books from which a lot of the anime television comes. And as I mentioned on another recent episode, a lot of the times I and my guests will talk about a work that someone else did, and we'll try to guess, why did the author do this? Why did the writer do that? And I'm finding it's actually kind of more fun if you just have the writer themselves on. And this is a first for this podcast. Now, today I have an author who has a book that if you Google it right now, you may not find it because it is yet to come out. But they were very kind to reach out and say, hey, do we want to do this podcast? And I was very excited to have. So I have today Helen McCarthy, the author of the Manga Bible, which, Helen, that is remind me the exact date that is going to become available.
That is going to be available in the USA on 24th of March. And in the UK on 5th of March. We get it before you guys.
Wonderful. Well, you know, I think you deserve that now, every now and then. Although please tell your readers, no spoilers for those of us who are going to follow it on Twitter. Yep. As you hear, Helen is joining me today. Helen, how are we doing today?
I am doing great, thank you. Apart from the fact that this time last week, I tripped over my own front doorstep and detached the head of my left humerus, which is not at all funny. Yeah, and so at the moment, I'm sitting here wearing this incredibly elegant blue surgical issue sling and waiting for a call from my orthopedic surgeon to say, get into the hospital now. We have drugs waiting. We're going to rebuild your arm. So I'm going to be bionic. You're getting me for the last time as a mere mortal. I'm about to have the Iron Man upgrade.
Well, I was about to say, as you were saying, I have watched enough anime and know enough about manga that often you go in there for a surgery and you come out being able to shoot laser beams, or
absolutely.
So
if I don't at least get laser beams and the power of flight, I'm going to be very disappointed.
I can understand. These are the kind of standards that this stuff is set for us.
Yeah.
Well, and so let me start there, because the Manga Bible, I got a chance to look at an early copy of it. It's a great book. For me, as someone who is not very knowledgeable about manga, I've learned about it. I've watched some anime. I've read somewhat about it. My former co-host Riki was incredible about helping to educate me about that stuff, as he had grown up with it. But it's still something I don't know very much about, and the book just does a great job of really kind of introducing you to that whole world. And Helen, I want to start by asking, one of the things you talk about in the book is there's a lot of stereotypes about the kind of folks who do read this or don't read this and stuff like that. And I have to say, when someone reached out to me and said, a person has read a book about manga as sort of an overview of it, a little old British lady was not what I was expecting. And I'm kind of curious. Talk to us a bit about what was your personal journey exploring all this?
I love that. Yeah, you would never believe the number of people who meet me, not knowing me, and say, you really ought to retire and make room for the rest of us. My answer is, because I've done a dozen books now, and I love to write. I love what I do. I speak all over the UK, and when I get the chance overseas, and I say, just bring it. Come on, do your book. I want your book. I would never have written my book my first book, if someone else had written the book I wanted. But I actually started looking at anime and manga in 1981. And the reason I started it is it's a love story. I met a guy. And I met a guy who was such a keeper that he is still my life partner. But he had just been on a graduation trip with his art school friends. They were all like fine art graduates, illustration graduates. And they went to Mallorca, which is an island that's part of Spain. Right. Now, Mallorca is famous for three things for young Brits leaving college: sun, sea, and sex. But this lot, being art graduates, they actually wanted to see the culture. And so they went out into the town and they kind of explored all the little back alleyways and shops, and they watched local TV. And one night they saw a giant robot cartoon marathon that exploded their tiny brains.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because they were illustration students, they were art students, they were used to interpreting things through visuals.
Right.
Rather than me, I come from a story background. My family is Irish. We've told stories since I was in the cradle. I follow narrative. But they were suddenly looking at a new way of telling stories visually in a style that they'd never met, and they loved it.
Yeah.
And so, long story short, they came home. Steve and I met. We did the usual boy-girl thing, went to meet each other's families, went round to each other's place, and he said to me, okay, I'm going to show you the stuff we picked up in Mallorca in the summer, because there's this amazing thing called manga, an anime, that's really Japanese, but it's all over Spain. And he showed me the stuff that they got, and I thought, this is really interesting, because I read no Spanish. I read no Japanese either at that time, but I read no Spanish. And yet I could follow the story, not the fine detail, but I could follow the story through the narrative line.
Right.
I thought, here is a way of telling stories that doesn't depend on my verbal competence. And that really fascinated me, because I thought, if you can take this from one language, Japanese, into another language, Spanish, and make that still communicate to someone who speaks neither language, this is sensational. Anime and manga just seemed to me like the most astonishing visual language, and I had to find out more. And that was where essentially my writing career was born.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things in that story that I love. First, I'll just say I have a similar thing in that I had very little contact with either anime or manga or a lot of things Japanese until I met my spouse, Mary, who is herself white. She's from Minnesota, where I now live, but she became very involved in those worlds when she was a kid. She spent a semester in Japan, and so she had kind of been my introduction to that. So I do love that part of your story. I will say the sad thing is that I was born in the 70s. I'm in Gen X. And I do remember that when I was in college, a lot of my friends first started getting into anime. This was when the movie Akira was coming out, and things like Ranma 1/2 and Revolutionary Girl Utena were out. And they were all convinced that they had discovered anime. And so hearing that it was, this was in the late 90s. So hearing that it was out in the early 80s, even in Spain, is a little hard to hear. But I trust that it's possible my generation didn't actually discover all of these good things for the West. So I love hearing that.
To tell you the truth, though, doesn't every generation rediscover its own thing then be terribly surprised that its elders have had some similar experience? I remember one of my nephews, and I adore my nephews, and I'm lucky that we get on really well, came up to me one day and said, I found this incredible band. I was just nosing around YouTube, and there's old videos, and I don't know anyone who knows this, and they're amazing. They're a bit rough. They're a bit edgy.
Oh, no.
But they're great. Iron Maiden. And I thought, okay, kiddo, do I actually tell you now the whole story? Or do I? And I let him educate me. And a few years later, he said to me, I know what you did there. And that was really nice.
In high school, a friend of mine introduced me to a lot of great older music, including Creedence Clearwater Revival, which is still a favorite of mine. And I was playing, and I thought it was the coolest thing in the world until my dad got home, heard it, and goes, oh, yeah, I love this music. And all of a sudden, it wasn't so cool anymore.
Yeah, that's the slayer, isn't it? When your dad tells you at the point of entry, or your big brother, and that's one reason why anime and manga have been so successful, because they tend to retell the same type of story, but they dress them in new clothes every incarnation, so that the kids who are seeing them land now, the 7-year-olds, 10-year-olds, are not seeing the same story their big brothers had.
Right.
But the big brothers can still relate to it because it's the kind of story they love. And that's part of the genius of this whole medium of storytelling, that they pick up threads, almost like myth themes, in much the same way that American comics do. Myth themes and political themes and ideological themes run all the way through, but they're always presented in new clothes for the generation that's approaching them for the first time.
Yeah.
And that I think is wonderful. That's genius.
No, that's so very true. It's so very true. And I'm glad you mentioned American comics, because that was one of my next questions. Was you talk about how for both you and your husband, this sort of idea of visual storytelling was so kind of revolutionary for you. And of course, while anime and manga are its own thing, we do have comic books in America and England and places like that. And I'm curious for you, what was it? How did anime and manga? Because I think sometimes it's easy to just say, "Oh, manga is just Japanese comic books," and that may be technically true, but really doesn't capture the essence of it. What was it specifically about manga and anime that spoke to you in a way that maybe Batman or Archie hadn't?
Well, two things. Um, First of all, Batman, Archie, most American comics, to be fair, a lot of British comics
Uh huh.
had no place for me when I
Mm,
first encountered comics. I read comics as a child because when I was growing up, Britain had stacks of girls' comics and kind of cross-gender comics
yeah.
that girls or boys could read. And I read those with great enthusiasm, but they died out around the 60s for a variety of structural reasons I won't go into. Um, and as a girl going into comic shops and finding only American comics, the atmosphere was often actively hostile.
Hmm.
Reading the comics, the atmosphere was often actively hostile. They
Oh
only
yeah.
had room for one kind of girl. Every other kind of girl was subsidiary.
Hmm.
Um, Older women were nothing, and I come from a culture of older women where they're very much something. Older
Yeah.
women were there to make the beds and provide the clothes and so on. The American comics excluded me at that
Mm,
time. They weren't interested in me. I was told you can be on the sideline. And then I got into Japanese comics, where fair enough, a lot of Japanese boys' comics have the same kind of roles for females. But there's a whole separate thread of Japanese girls' comics and women's comics and drama comics that cater for anyone and
mm,
comedy comics that cater for anyone, where I was told, yeah, there are comics that are just for you. If you want to exclude the guys, you can get those. But there are also comics that show you in high school with the boys on equal terms.
right.
And that was a revelation to me. It was the fact that Japanese comics gave me a place that I didn't find anywhere else except in French and Italian comics.
Mm,
And the other thing was, it was that business of telling the story through narrative line, not through words, but through images. If you've ever looked at one of my countrymen, Barry Windsor Smith, who did a lot of great comics for Marvel, did a lot of
mhm,
Conan and so on. I love Barry. He's a fabulous artist, but he crams every inch of the page with squiggly little black lines.
yeah.
And those inches of the page that squiggly little black lines aren't on, he writes novels in.
Yeah.
So many British comic writers, so many American comic writers think that in order to be effective, they have to occupy space on the page, and they don't. Their role is to, in my view, is to provide the narrative structure that enables the artist to bring the story to life.
Yeah.
Keep steering the artist towards the best opportunities, the best ways of doing it, but not to try and go equal space, mano a mano with the artist. When I see a comic where the writer is obviously saying, I'm going to take up as much space in this as the pictures, so help me God, I think, please, please.
Yeah. Well,
So for me, manga did both those things and did them magnificently.
yeah. Well, and that's so interesting because, like, as someone for myself, I'm much more. My brain has never really been able to process the comic book or the manga quite as well as the when it moves to a TV screen or the like.
Mm.
But I know a little bit. But if you ask me the names of famous comic creators, what I'll come up with is Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, who I know did some art, but then also Grant Morrison and Alan Moore and all these who are all writers. It's not
Yeah,
artists.
yeah,
And I love what you're talking about there about feeling welcome because in many years ago, I had a wonderful guest named Jessica Plummer who does incredible stuff about women in American comics.
mhm,
And one thing we've talked about was how a character like Lois Lane, who is introduced in the 30s and the 40s as this woman journalist and just crackpot and able to do so many great things. And then by the 50s and the 60s and the Hays Code in American comics, now she's just the girl with hearts in her eyes pining after
yeah,
Superman and all that. And so it's interesting to hear that the other side of that about how, if that's what you're raised with, of course, yet something that really shows women characters, other kind of characters who aren't featured as much in very different ways would be much more appealing.
Well, the other thing I think is that women are very strongly represented as creators in the Japanese
Mm,
comic universe,
right.
which until fairly recently hasn't always been true. I mean, my other half is a huge Marvel and DC fan.
Yeah.
And he's got all the old comics going way back and all the critical stuff. And when looking at his stories of the Marvel bullpen, there's this one girl in there, Mary Severin, and she's there because her brother works there, basically.
Mm.
And she's astonishing. She's a real talent. She's a writer. She's an artist. She's an admin person. She's a wrangler. She's a great liaison with the fans. But it's her. I mean, outside on the streets of America, just as on the streets of everywhere else in the world, it's pretty much 50-50 male-female.
Yeah.
In a comic book office that's selling dreams and ethics and ideas to American kids, we got one girl in the office and we got maybe 3 or 4 girls for every 8 or 9 guys in the magazines.
Yep.
And unless the girls are superheroines with superpowers, they're nowhere. Well, trust me, we are used to that. You know, we've been fighting that for years. Most of us have been fighting that since the days of the suffragettes, but we don't care for it in representational terms. And if you have a look at anime and manga, the women who started out doing manga often started out in the same way guys did. They were in small towns all over Japan. In the after-war years, when Japan was pretty poor and took a while to get its economy going, they looked at comics and they thought, wow, I love this story. I love these people. I identify with this team going into space. I identify with this high school. I identify with these adventurers trying to bust racketeering rings. I'm in there.
Yeah.
Great, let me do a comic. Now, where things started in Japan is that people started very small, very often in high schools or local community halls, doing their own comic circles. And they would make their own comics and share them. And somewhere along the line, the idea came up that if we could afford to make copies of these comics instead of just having to pass the one we've drawn around everyone, maybe we could, share them more widely, and maybe we could make a bit of cash, who knows, and talk to other comic fans. And so gradually, and particularly in the 70s, there grew up a range of different comic fairs and comic markets where complete amateurs would sell their goods to each other in local school halls, in local county halls, just tiny places. And gradually this built up a network of places where girls and boys alike could get together in what they called circles, doujin circles, to make magazines, comic magazines, often parodies or homages to their favorites, and they could sell them on weekends. And gradually they built up a chain where today Comic-Con, the twice yearly comic market in Tokyo, is, I think, the single biggest non-sports fan event in the world.
Oh,
Just
really?
before the pandemic, they were averaging 750,000 people.
Wow.
At their marts. And now they're building up slowly, obviously, since the pandemic. But all those people come from all over Japan to either sell the comics they've made or buy the comics other fans have made. And it's expanded to a whole fan ecosystem. And that gives girls a way in.
Well, and that's such an incredible story because, the ones that we hear about, at least here in the States especially, it's the San Diego Comic-Con, is things like that, which are very dominated by the big publishing houses, Marvel, DC, or a lot of the television and movie studios and stuff. And I think you did a great job of tracing the history of manga all the way back to, illustrations from hundreds of years ago that really have the roots traced. And I love this idea of something that, because I think for a lot of creative people, anyone can write something, anyone can draw something, but then we have, at least in the States, and I think in Britain and other places, these big corporations that get to control what gets published, what makes it to the TV screen, what goes out to the comic book stores. And so knowing that this entire industry kind of grew up around people just skipping that middleman entirely, and it's kind of I'm thinking of like a farmer's market where people don't have to sell their stuff to the grocery stores. They just sell it directly. And so I was just so thrilled reading about how that happened in the manga world.
What I love about that is that an awful lot of people use that system just for fun, just for their hobby, because they love it. And like all of us, when we have hobbies in our teens, some people drop out along the way. You meet people, you meet guys, you meet girls, you get a job, you go to uni, all these things happen. But you can carry on with it at the level that you want. And if you happen to make it big, great. But then, of course, if you make it big, if you do something like go to one of the big comic publishers and they say, we love you. Right. We've got a book ready for you. Come on. Like Marvel. I mean, there's a great, got an author in the book, an artist in the book that I talk about who works as Baron Yoshimoto. Now, Baron Yoshimoto is a really great artist, a great classical artist in every sense, but he also did manga and was very successful. He went to America and was very enthused by American comics. So he wrapped up all his work in Japan and went to America, and Stan Lee loved him and got him to do some comics for him. But Stan wanted him to do Japanese stuff. And he was saying, I'm in America. I'm an artist. I've studied Michelangelo. I've studied Dali.
Yeah.
You just want me to draw samurai and geisha. And, that's not me. And so off he went to do illustrations for people like Playboy. But in Japan, he would have a way around that. If his big, dark, whatever studio or imprint said, we just want you to do these 2 very famous books that you're doing for us. We want you to stick to your groove. We don't want you to experiment. He could just shrug and say, okay. And then he could go to the fan market and put out whatever he liked under a pseudonym.
Right.
Put out parodies of his own work, put out parodies of other work, put out totally different work. Let's say that he was working in the teen market, the kind of junior high school market, but he wanted to take some of those characters further and darker into erotica or into extreme violence or into extreme politics. He could go and do that under a pseudonym in the fan market. So as a creator, your opportunities and your choices are only limited by your energy and the amount of work you're prepared to put in. It's possible for you to function both as a well-known creator for a major imprint and as the edgiest indie artist on the block under another name.
I love that. Well, and the Stan Lee story, I think, is so important because, and granted, Stan Lee himself, I think we well know, is, for all the things that were great about him, by no means a paragon of racial understanding. And you look at a lot of the Marvel and DC heroes who we think of today as great representation, and a lot of them started as very much sort of stereotypical caricature, like Luke Cage being very much blaxploitation, and early characters, who are Asian being very much that. And so for Stan Lee to say, "Oh, you're Asian, you of course must draw only, Japanese stuff."
Yeah.
But I'll admit, that's something I think that, like, when I was first discovering manga and anime, I had some of that as well. And I remember encountering things like Howl's Moving Castle and being like, wait, this is a story about European castles. This is not what I would have thought. And, finding, this is obviously somewhat derived from, this is live action, but when I found the Kurosawa movies that are very much, it is a samurai movie that is 100% Shakespeare, the ones that he did. Throne of Blood being Macbeth, and I think, is it Ron that
is King Lear.
King Lear? Yeah, exactly. And talk a bit about that, about how, because I think one of the things about manga that is so interesting that you talk about in your book is that it is not by any means just topics that people think of as like Japanese storytelling.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, in the West, certainly in the 80s, the 90s, right up until really broadband spread so wide, our idea of Japan was that it was samurai and geisha and castles, and everybody does tea ceremony. When all the while that we were thinking that, people were growing up in Japan just like us, thinking that everyone in the West was completely equal, completely fair, completely non-discriminating. Everybody had jobs, everybody had money, everybody had cars. The Japanese were sold a story of us by the occupying authorities that legally could not be challenged. Nobody was allowed to challenge it. That the West was an absolute fairyland of equality and justice. At exactly the same time that people like Stan Lee, who, all right, wasn't perfect, none of those comics guys were perfect, but give them credit. They fought for what they believed in. People like that were writing blaxploitation comics and saying, look, you're presenting America as this wonderland of equality all over the world. What about Black Americans? Right. What are you doing for Black Americans? What are you doing for women? What are you doing for ethnic minority American? What are you doing for Native Americans? There was all of that coming in. And I think ethically, to me, it seems the West has walked a really difficult line and is still walking a really difficult line, because we tell ourselves that our ethics are the pure classical Greco-Roman ideals, well, great. They believed that democracy belonged to men who owned property and slavery was fine for everyone else and women shouldn't be seen outside the home.
Yeah.
So maybe Greco-Roman democracy isn't all that hot. Maybe we've built our ethics on a questionable foundation. And in the same way, many Asian ethics are still patriarchal. Obviously, Chinese Confucianism is the huge example. But all over Asia, Japan being no exception till very recently, women and ethnic minorities are still fighting for their recognition. Do you know when the Ainu people of Japan, one of the Aboriginal peoples of Hokkaido, first got recognized as a separate ethnicity?
I want to say, I don't know if it's from your book or something else, but I remember something like it was 2005 or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. And until very recently, many Ainu people were not allowed to speak their own language, literally not allowed to speak their own language. Now, my family are Irish, and we had that experience with the British in Ireland. Welsh people share the same experience. So I think, that triggers me quite powerfully. But the whole system that we base honorable superheroes on, or honorable superheroines on, is very skewed towards what Western majority culture, which of course was skewed by religion, which had a vested interest in keeping guys in control, has bought into. And so for me, the other thing about Japan is it said, look, this isn't perfect either. This is a patriarchy too, but there are ways of doing patriarchy differently. And also, let's unpick what happens when two different kinds of patriarchy collide and people start doing a pick and mix, because that's what happened in Japan in the years after America opened it up to the world. All the major colonial nations dived on Japan like ravenous wolves and behaved very badly, it has to be said. We gave Japan its pattern for colonization, and Japan went and repeated that in China with disastrous results. It behaved very badly. But that whole thing showed people that there were a lot of different ways of approaching living in a modern, evolving, developing society, that you could do it and make a place for yourself, even if you started out with nothing, even if you started out really, really poor. I mean, one of the things that I always point people at, which they laugh at hilariously, is Downton Abbey. But Downton Abbey presents a society that was frozen in time before World War One, fractured completely by World War One, had to learn to adapt. And by the time you got to just before World War Two, people who beforehand would never have left their villages, would have been literally the only gay in the village in the case of one character, or never have had the chance to finish school, were finding that in this new, much more confused, but much more diverse world, they could get an education, they could remake themselves in a new name, they could shed their past completely and become someone else. And that, I think, is one of the things that anime and the development of Japan after the war offers to the Japanese people and to us fans coming in later, that there are ways we can remake ourselves. We just have to choose better role models than the ones the world is selling us. And that, again, is where, for me, manga comes in really strongly, because if you look at some of the great characters in manga, they are fallible and they often screw up completely, but many of them are fantastic role models. You mentioned Howl in Howl's Moving Castle. Howl is actually a Welshman. He's Howell Pendragon, and he comes from Diana Wynne Jones's great novel Howl's Moving Castle, which is one of a trilogy. But Miyazaki keeps that Welsh vibe with him because he actually loves Wales. He did a whole movie set in Wales long before Howl's Moving Castle. He did Castle in the Sky. And Howl is someone who will take the money, he's not above taking money from the man or the establishment or whatever, and do the best he can with it. But gradually, as he grows up, as we see him mature through the film, he realizes that he's not that person. He can be better. He can do better. And with the help of not just the love of his life, but of his friends, he is better and he does better. So anime and manga give us all these diverse views of people that are really, you really wouldn't be rooting for them from the word go. But they come through. And it's one of the things I love about the work of the late, great Akira Toriyama, who did Dragon Ball. He said he liked having his main characters being little, literally, physically little, little
Mm,
tiny people, old guys like Turtle Hermit
right.
or like Son Goku, who nobody would pick to win a fight against this big, enormous, powered being. And he said he liked to show that little people could really, really surprise you. And of course, that was a brilliant move because
Right.
most of the people that read his manga initially were kids, junior high, some
Oh yeah.
elementary, and they're always the little guys, aren't they? Even
What
the ones that are big for their age are always the little guys.
and again, it's another wonderful way of like similar themes popping up because you say that, and immediately in my head, I hear Gandalf quoting, saying the words written by J.R.R. Tolkien about, hobbits, the smallest of people, can have the biggest of effect. And I'm
Oh yeah.
horribly butchering the line. There's like 4 to 5 things I want to jump on from what you said there. So we'll kind of go through. First of all, just a personal pride. You talked about the Welsh. You can't see it well enough, but behind me is the iconography of Clan Davis from Wales, which is my mother's family is Davis. And
Yeah.
in this one, it shows that our clan once owned 2 castles. And
Wow.
I think there are 20 different people who will sell stupid Americans 20 different ideas of what their ancient clan back in the British Isles was. So I have no claim to it historically, but I do, point out the love of the Welsh and the castles. But going back, especially to what you were talking about with kind of the recognizing the problems in your own culture and then looking to the others, especially I think in the 90s and early 2000s when at least a lot of my contemporaries were really jumping headfirst into manga, anime, and kind of through that all things Japan. We were in high school, we were in college, we thought we were the smartest kids in the world.
Yeah.
And so of course we were, that was the age at which we were realizing that the idea of, as you said, the perfect West, capitalism and all this stuff was what that had been sold to us was maybe not so good.
Hmm.
And we began a process that I think now people can look back on and see as just as problematic, where it became, okay, well, West bad, East good.
Yeah.
America totally bad, Japan totally good. And this name, a weeb, became, I don't know if it took place, it took root in Britain, but certainly in America for the American kid who was just obsessed with all things Japanese.
Yes.
And that it could sometimes come from a place of respect, but it could certainly also take on a aura of, exotification and Orientalism and like, oh, the mysterious West and the mysterious Japan and all of its wonder and things like that. And that being incredibly racist in its own way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious if you saw that. I don't know to what extent that is an American phenomenon, or if in terms of British fan culture and other European fan culture, you saw elements of that and kind of how that played into your understanding of the history of how manga and anime have been seen in the West.
Well, I saw a lot of that actually at home because
Mm-hmm.
my father never actually served in Asia. He was in Africa
Yep.
and in Greece, in Gallipoli and around that area. But he had a lot of friends who served in Asia, including some who died in Japanese concentration camps and some who died on the Burma Railroad. So he was like many men of his generation in the British and the American army, very anti-Japanese.
Yeah.
Later in life, he said to me that he had thought about it and he thought that they were probably just like him, guys who were called up and told you're going to serve your country and you're going to stop foreigners coming in and attacking your mums and dads and raping your wives and killing your little brothers and sisters. And so he said they were coming from the same place I was. And I recognize that now, but I still think that as a culture, it's really, really negative. It's very militaristic. It's very violent. It's very dismissive of non-Japanese people. And I thought, okay. And at the time, I didn't know anything about Japanese, but what I'd learned in school history. But as I got older and I started to explore more, I just gradually, I think as we all do when we leave home and we leave our small towns and we go on, I thought, well, look, I'm from an Irish family. My family spent its entire life being colonized and victimized by the British. And now we live in Britain, most of us. We're the people back home are fine. They have their freedom. We've got our own ideas, and we have British friends and British colleagues and British workmates. And I kind of thought, that's surely the same for the Germans. Not all Germans are Nazis. Mm-hmm. Not all Germans were Nazis. Okay, we can argue that they could have done a bit more to stand up to the Nazis, but I wasn't there, so I wasn't going to make that call. I said to myself, the Japanese are probably exactly like me, except they speak a different language and they've got different food groups and different cultural stuff and so forth.
Right.
But as humans, they probably come from the same place I do. They want their family to be okay. They want to do all right in school. They want to get a decent job, maybe meet the right person, maybe have a family of their own. They just want what I want. And so, from that point of view, my own background gave me the ability to access
Yeah.
Japan on a slightly better level, I think, than a lot of people had, because there really weren't many Japanese people in Britain.
Yeah.
In the 80s, when Steve and I started getting interested in tracking anime and manga, there were two or three, luckily we both lived in London, and there were two or three Japanese shops in London. But they mostly catered to the Japanese expat market.
Mm.
For example, the Japan Centre, which used to be in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, and all of that has gone now, it's all been rebuilt. But the Japan Centre was down a little alley, and it was kind of like a secret code between burgeoning manga and anime and Japan lovers, because you'd say to people when you met them, where do you get your stuff? Do you know about the Japan Centre? Oh, you don't? Well, this is the address, this is the phone number. Call me when you're coming down, we'll go. They had maybe two staff who spoke much English, because their clientele was mostly Japanese. And suddenly these kids were going in there with copies of Japanese photocopied bits from game magazines, mostly, saying, this robot, this book. And they were, they were a general Japanese store. They did books, they did magazines, they did general goods. You could get matcha there, you could get tea sets there, that sort of thing. And suddenly they were faced with these kids bringing in bits of Japanese pop culture from gaming magazines and saying, help.
Yeah, that helps find this.
They gradually got more English-speaking staff, which was good. But for a long time, you would go there and you would order New Type magazine, which became our go-to, or Hobby Japan magazine, which is also another go-to, at hugely inflated prices, because of course all they could do was import them and pay the import duty and the transit. So we paid that and get them and share them around your friends. And bit by bit, we built up that knowledge. But I'm sure most of the Japanese people in these shops thought we were absolutely crazy.
Yeah.
They would get these magazines in for Japanese teenagers who came in, and most of us were 20-somethings, some of us a bit older, working, bringing our stuff in. They must have thought we were wild, but after they'd known us for a little while, after they'd known Steve and I for a little while, they actually let us know that they had a library of tapes sent from Japan that they rented out to Japanese customers. And they said, if you can play them, if you have a Japanese video player, we can rent them to you, but of course they're all in Japanese.
Yeah.
But, we could go there and we could pay them what seemed like a lot of money at the time, but actually was, about £5, about half a day's salary, and rent a videotape with 3 hours of somebody in Japan had recorded it off the air and sent it to them so that people could keep up with their shows. And we could rent that and we could share it with friends and sit and try and puzzle it out together. So bit by bit, we made our way. And the sharing that people were willing to do once they trusted you, and they knew that you were okay, you were a regular customer, there was that relationship, was really lovely.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, that makes some sense. And I think because especially when it does, I love what you talked about with the Irish history there. I spent, it's not the same by any means, but I spent a year studying at Trinity when I was in college and really loved the culture there. And I think both then, but also more recently, as we've seen Ireland be one of the leaders of calling out, colonialism in Gaza and East Timor when that happened in other places, a recognition of, that it's a Western country, but that also has an experience of being colonized rather than the colonizer. And so it makes sense to be so different from the American relationship to it. I want to talk a little bit more, though, about that time after World War II that you talked about, because one of my favorite episodes that we've done on here was about the original movie Gojira, the Godzilla, as it's known in the West, and the Japanese version of it, because the first version of it that came to the United States was very edited, and an American character was inserted, in part because the original movie is done right at the end of the American occupation of Japan, and is in very many ways a commentary on that occupation, but especially also of Japan coming to terms with, being the one and only country that's been the victim of a nuclear attack, and just how horrific that was in ways that they could never talk about, with American soldiers on every street. And so that kind of got me really interested in this idea of, and I think it's true in American horror movies as well, that like something like a monster movie, a Gojira movie, could kind of get around the censors, because it would be it is a metaphor without directly saying like, hey, the Americans did this horrible thing to us.
Yeah.
And so very interesting in your book, talking about how a lot of the kind of early manga of the late 1940s and 50s, or what would become manga, was doing something similar, of exploring people's feelings about World War II and the American occupation and all of that. Can you say a little bit more about kind of what manga was doing at that time?
Well, during the war itself, manga was actually fairly marginalized. Japan, like Britain, like France, like many countries that were fighting without much money, essentially channeled all supplies away from non-essentials like entertainment and clothing and everyday stuff into the war effort. So even paper was really difficult to get. You had to get government chits to get paper. And the same with film. You had to get government chits to get film and cameras and cameramen and camera time. So an awful lot of people in Japan whose basic thing was making manga couldn't do it.
Right.
If they were well in with the establishment, they could. But some people hesitated to do the level of government propaganda that was wanted. But manga was kind of marginalized, that the government didn't seem to want to involve manga writers in the war effort. There were a number of manga writers who enthusiastically supported the Japanese war effort and who were fully behind Japanese colonization of Asia, because they saw it as fighting Western colonization of Asia. And their reasoning was, if we have a strong Asian power leading a strong Asian coalition, this will be better than Western powers taking control, stealing our resources and exploiting us. And looking at how history has gone, who can argue? It's just the Japanese didn't make the best job of it because they used Western role models. But I think that it was so difficult for people to resist and to stand up. And again, it goes back to what I was saying about Nazis. I mean, now show me a Nazi, I will punch them, because we all have choices. Then I'm not so sure that I can judge, because you could literally be disappeared off the street and your family murdered if you resisted. But for the Japanese, anyone who raised their head or their voice against the war effort was perfectly simple. Every man in their family was recruited and sent to the Pacific Front, where the majority of them died. The great writer and folklore scholar and manga artist Shigeru Mizuki was, I think he was 19 when he was sent to the front. He was the only member of his platoon of about 150 to come back at 22, minus one arm. It was that bad. And so people tended to toe the line. So most manga was either done by people who enthusiastically believed in what the government was doing and made propaganda, or by people who were keeping their heads down and being as quiet as they could. But there wasn't much of it.
And I just want to interject. I want to hear more of the story. But for anyone who might think that and start wanting to judge the manga artists who are doing propaganda, take a look at Superman from that time, where he is beating up horrifically racist caricatures of Japanese soldiers and things like that. And as you said, every look at World War I British comic strips about the Huns, the Germans, and recruiting artists of all stripes into propaganda is just what governments do during war. It's by no means unique to Japan and manga.
And there was a recognition of this among Japanese manga artists, who actually ran a magazine for a while, which the government later shut down because they thought it was too left-wing for them. Even though this magazine was presenting examples of people from other countries who'd used comics to support their own war efforts. And they specifically cited Chinese comics protesting against the actions of the Japanese and suggesting ways to fight the Japanese. So artists were looking at this across the spectrum and saying what we should be doing is borrowing these guys' tactics and using it to fight our own war on the home front to win hearts and minds and keep morale going. The Japanese government was like, nah, we won't do that, thank you. So You can't tell governments anything. They always think they know everything, and it's one reason why they so often fail, because most of them are not geared for change and not geared for speed. But that's a discussion that we'll be having in a much more serious way all over the world for the rest of this year. So
Yeah.
there you go. But no, it was very interesting to see how in the wartime years, manga was virtually broken. It
Mm.
was before the war, there'd been a rich, dynamic manga culture with really exciting science fiction, really thrilling drama, really thrilling romance, all sorts of good ideas coming out there, a strong strand of girls' love, really powerful stuff. The war broke it, and luckily, a few people who had worked before the war and had kept their noses clean enough that the occupation authorities didn't ban them, and a
Right.
few young people who came up during the war managed to start doing manga after the war that carried that tradition forward. Because you've got to remember, for a decade in Japan, kids didn't have comics. They
Yeah.
had kind of virtuous, preachy stuff, but they didn't have proper comics. So that was a whole generation that had grown up with no idea of what comics could be. So
Mm.
teenagers like Osamu Tezuka, who was 18 when the war ended, and older guys like Ryuichi Yokoyama, who had been working through the war and trying to keep his head down, had to come back and restart comics with all the stuff they remembered. And that led to some really interesting misunderstandings. Because
Right.
those of us in the West that started looking at comics in the 70s and the 80s in Japan had no knowledge of what had gone before. You have to remember that for a very long time, really until I'd say the mid 25s, 210s, not that many people in the West read Japanese.
Yeah.
Not many people even spoke Japanese, but reading Japanese and being able to translate Japanese, that was rare.
Right.
And as a result, not that many scholars who were not necessarily Japanese scholars first and foremost, but were anthropologists, ethnologists, literature scholars, art scholars, comic scholars, not many of them could access Japanese material.
Mm.
They didn't have the contacts. They weren't encouraged to make the academic contacts outside English, and they just didn't have the language. So until we actually got to about, I've been studying anime since 1981. Until we got to about 1995, I had a lot of really stupid notions based on assumptions made based on post-war stuff. I
Yeah.
gradually began to clear those out, but it's still taking a while. I still catch myself thinking things and say, no, check that because it's changed.
Yeah.
We didn't actually find out what had gone on in pre-war Japan and wartime Japan till a long time after. So a lot of wrong assumptions grew up. A lot of people would tell you that Osamu Tezuka invented girls manga, which of course he didn't. He gave it a huge boost after the war, but he didn't invent it. Or Osamu Tezuka invented cinema manga, which of course he didn't. A lot of mangaka, some of whom had read Japanese, Western comics like German comics, English comics, French comics, American comics, got the cinematic idea from newspaper strips in all those languages.
Oh, yeah.
So all of that stuff was there waiting to be discovered, but we didn't have the tools to discover it until quite recently. And now we live in and one of the things I say in the book, and I'm going to hold the book up if I may, because I love this. Oh, it doesn't want to do it. Yes, it does want to do it. The Manga Bible says, one of the things it says is that we live now in a golden age for manga and for anime. We have so many materials made available to us straight from Japan, almost as soon as they appear in Japan. We have so many more people doing translation. We have so many more tools to enable us to stumble towards language ourselves. You can sign up to Duolingo for free and start studying.
One thing I always thought was this wonderful irony was that a lot of I think you're right. There's huge ignorance about so much about Japan for so much of our history. Now the filter is not kidding away, and I'll make sure a picture of it is in the show notes.
There we go, the Manga Bible.
And I one of the things that I think you saw, at least in the United States in the 80s and early 90s, was all of a sudden there was a focus on learning Japanese and eating sushi and learning Japanese customs for business. Yeah. Because this was when we really start, really starting to interact a lot more with Japanese business and Japanese finance was seen as super important. And so you had a lot of these people who really wanted their kids to study Japanese so they could go off and be, capitalist masters of the universe. And then those kids took the Japanese that their parents made them study in school and used it to read manga. which I
Yes.
just thought was this wonderful irony. And it brings me to one of the last questions I want to ask you, because this is a fantastic conversation. We could go on for so much longer, but I do want to respect your time. But I will admit, when I first got contacted by your folks, one of my first thoughts was, what is a British lady doing writing about a Japanese art form? And not that it's an art form, everyone should be able to engage with it and things like that. But like knowing how many and that, not Britain is bad, America's worse, but knowing all the assumptions that you yourself talk about. And one thing I was really struck by your book was, it felt like you weren't trying to give the definitive history of manga. You were really trying to write, hey, people in the West, here's what you should understand about manga, and here's how it felt very addressed to that audience from your perspective. Talk a little bit more about what that process, because I have to imagine that somewhere along the way someone said, wait, you're going to write the Manga Bible? Like, what was that process like?
Well, actually, the process was really interesting. The publishers are Octopus, who are an imprint of Hachette. And about 10 years ago, they bought a small British imprint called Ilex Press. Now, Ilex had always done design-led, picture-led, photographic and technical books on all sorts of interesting subjects. And they asked me to write a book for a little series of theirs that was called A Brief History of. And they asked me to do a brief history of manga. Now, the book is about slightly bigger than a standard snapshot. About 7.5 inches by 5. It weighs less than a sandwich, and it gives you the whole history of manga up till 2012, which is when I finished writing it, with 96 pages with a ton of pictures and a historical timeline. And that book was a big success. It's still selling pretty well, and it was popular because it was easy to read, it was light, it was fast, it didn't talk down to its audience, it was fun. The same imprint came to a friend of mine a while back, a wonderful, wonderful manga creator, who's very active and also one of the most stylish women I know, and said, would you write us a Manga Bible that goes a bit further than this book that we did 10 years ago does, and is bigger and kind of more comprehensive? And she said, well, why don't you just ask the woman who wrote it? And they again, assumptions, they didn't know I was still around. So they contacted me and said, we want a book called the Manga Bible. Can you do it? And I thought, can I do it? Obviously. But that was the whole idea. We love the attitude of A Brief History of Manga. We love the colors and the vibrancy and the willingness to engage with the audience where they are.
Yeah.
And that's where we want you to start. Can you do a history of manga? And I thought, the Manga Bible, it's a big title. It's a lot to take on. It brings a lot of expectations. It brings the expectation that you will be holy writ.
Right.
And there is no such thing. Anyone who is an historian, which is what I was educated as first and foremost, knows that what we are doing is we are digging through piles of rubble to get the latest thing to give us a bit more knowledge, and that we then become the piles of rubble other people dig through. I am actually building steps with my work, not walls. I'm building steps so other people can stand on my work and go further than I could. And I've seen this in my own career. I've seen other people enabling me to go further than I thought I could, and now I'm enabling others. So the idea was, we'll do a book that doesn't talk down to anyone, but that doesn't baby you either, that says, keep up, there are statistics, there are languages, there are multiple nations, there are multiple cultures involved. And that takes the approach that this is going to be fun. But I must admit, an unworthy hope with the Manga Bible was that somebody in the Bible Belt would look at it and start a big book burning.
I love that.
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, they would buy hundreds of books to burn them. And that's great. And for another thing, it would be all across American TV, which is also great. But I don't think I've worked hard enough on it, really. I don't think I've made it sinful enough. Except I do include quite a lot of gay stuff. So maybe, you never know. But it is perfectly true. And we've got that story in the Manga Bible from Go Nagai, who, for his breakthrough manga, wrote Shameless School, which was about what now would seem quite mild, but then were scandalous sexual goings-on in a high school. And it was burnt by parent-teacher associations in Japan. And, of course, immediately its profile went through the roof. Its imprints sold out.
Of
he
course.
did well off it. And he thought to himself, right, in future, pick your battles and pick the ones that will get the most publicity. And that, God love him, is what he's done ever since. So I'm kind of hoping somewhere out there, if any of your listeners are, I don't wish to offend anybody and I don't wish to presume, but if somebody wanted to do a really good book burning on national television, I would be so for it.
I will see if I can help you in a different way, because I do live in Minneapolis, which I don't know how far the name.
Place.
Yeah, beautiful place, but also I'm not sure how far this news has gotten across the pond, but our dear, wonderful president has set his eye upon us, and so now we are dealing with winter, but the ice is worse. And I am someone who is often out involved in those things, and so what I will try to do when your book comes out is see if I can, like, stand in front of a camera while holding your book, so that way,
that would be great.
The conservatives can say, "Oh, that book is clearly inspiring, people to fight against our noble ice troopers," and you can get associated with that somehow. So,
well, I have the greatest sympathy with you guys at the moment, because being in a Nazi moment is difficult for everybody, and resistance is hard. Resistance is very hard, and I totally get that, and I respect what you're all doing. But I wish that there were ways of smuggling books into these ice facilities, because smuggling food as well, of course, and medicine and doctors and reporters. But I wish there were ways of smuggling books in there, because I think in my darkest hours, which have been nothing like yours are at the minute, but in my very darkest hours, books have been my lifeline. And I really do think that whatever the form your book takes, whether it's a graphic novel, a comic book, a manga, a game, anything, if you've got something that can get you out of the dark, you just go with that. You hold on to that and keep it. And what manga have done for me, and what I think a good Bible does, is it doesn't tell you the absolute truth about everything, but it tells you how to find the absolute truth for yourself.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is what we should all be striving towards.
No, I think that's such a beautiful way of phrasing it. And I will close with it. There's so many more things I want us to talk about. We touched on the eroticism and how that's viewed and in both good and bad ways. And I want to do that. I know you wrote a book called 500 Heroes and Villains of Anime. And on the show, we're talking about the ethics of superhero stories. We talk a lot about villains and ethics and things like that. So I'd love to get you back for that. But I'll just close by saying this and let you have your following words. Because I think it really speaks to what you've always talked about. You talk about in the book about how these core ideas of culture can speak to these things. I spent a year in Ireland, as I said, and as someone who is a student of revolutionary movements, I spent a lot of time learning about, both the fight against the British in the 1800s and early 1900s, and then also what has happened in Ulster and all of that, with a lot of the idiot romanticization that a lot of Americans had at that time, but still, and learned about the art and the music. A couple of weeks ago, I was outside one of the ICE detention centers here in Minnesota, and with a bunch of people protesting, a lot of whom were Latino. And I started hearing a song in Spanish that sounded familiar, but was in Spanish lyrics. And I couldn't figure out until I realized the song was, I'm guessing because it was the tune, and I know enough of the lyrics to clarify it, The Man Behind the Wire, The Men Behind the Wire. Which some Americans might know, some might not, but it's a song that was sung about as part of the Troubles in the 60s and 70s. British soldiers, in an attempt to find IRA members, just detained anybody who looked like they might sort of kind of in any way be associated, which is exactly what ICE is doing. And the song is about, that even though they came with armored cars and tanks and guns, they came to take away our sons, but we won't forget the men behind the wire. And so hearing that sung in Spanish outside a detention center, it just made me cry, thinking about how it's the same fights, it's the same struggles, and it's the same art that we can use. And so that just really came to mind for me as I was thinking about your book.
Well, a good rebel song always travels. It can go across any language, but I think rebellion always travels, and it matters to us because we are the 95%.
Yeah.
We're, we too personally are among the richest of the 95% because we know where we're going to sleep tonight. We've got clean clothes for tomorrow, and we've got food in the refrigerator. But we've got a refrigerator. We've got a place to put a refrigerator. The ramifications are endless. But we are at a point where Western democracy is facing Western capitalism, and it's a death match. It's an absolute death match. The very few rich, technologically competent people in the world have decided that they are going to absorb all the money that we have and make us into feudal slaves living at their whim. And we have to say no.
Yeah.
We have to say no. And rebel songs, rebel flags, there's been wonderful use of the flag from the anime One Piece and the manga One Piece all
Mm.
across South America. And that just gives me hope.
Yeah.
All those things that we share, that common language that we share, we have got to use it. One of the things that I hate about the tech oligarchy is that they are trying to take over the language of Tolkien.
Yeah.
Palantir, for God's sake. What sort of name is that for an evil empire?
Right.
And they all seem to think that by adopting Tolkien's language, they will wear Tolkien's coat. They can't wear Tolkien's coat. They're not fit to wear Tolkien's coat. They're not fit to clean Tolkien's shoes.
Mm-hmm.
We do stand at the crossroads of civilization. But what we're fighting for is that everybody gets a share and that everybody gets a say. And in the end, whether you do it through games, through manga, through rock music, through anime, it doesn't matter. That's our fight. That's where we're going.
Yeah. Well, that is a perfect closing. So thank you so much, Helen. And just because, I want people to be able to listen to this and go, that sounds like a book I'd like to get. Or it sounds like this woman has written some other things I might want to find. If people come away from this thinking, I want to hear more about what Mrs. McCarthy has to say. Let me say, if people come away from this thinking, I want to find more about what Helen McCarthy has to say, where can they find the Manga Bible? Where can they find some of your other works?
Well, Prestel is doing the Manga Bible in the USA. So any good bookstore in the USA, Evil Empire, if you must, I don't judge. But there are a lot of good independent bookstores out there that need your business to survive. So go into an indie if you love me and buy the book anyway. Prestel are doing it on the 24th of March, but I have a website, helenmccarthy.net, where I'm not a very good web person, but I keep an update of all the things I'm doing, and I keep lists of my books, and I try and keep in touch. And you can also sign up for my very tedious monthly newsletter if you wish. It's British, so don't go expecting too much from it. It's much more. It's much less Downton Abbey and much more The Village. So we'll go there. But helenmccarthy.net is where you can always find me. I used to come to America 2 or 3 times a year to speak at major anime conventions, and sadly that is no longer possible. But hopefully in the future it will be possible. And hey, Canada, if you're looking to invite me, as long as I don't have to go through America, because honestly, my social media profile will get me disappeared by ICE. Yeah, I'm not worried about not getting into the US. I'm worried about only getting out on a one-way ticket to Venezuela. And that's
very fair. Yeah. I think it's very fair.
But please do come and engage with me. And also, I love to share details about other great British and American writers about manga, writers about anime. There are a lot of us out there, and we're all essentially fighting the good fight. So come and join us.
Well, and I love that. And I going back a bit, what you said about being a bridge is so important. At the end of your book, like a lot of writers, it seems like they want to say, just look at me. I'm the definitive word. I love that you end your book with a section on gurus, and you talk about and especially you talk about, like, you list all of the great Japanese museums and historians, because I think that's also a good way of you saying, like, yes, you're writing from outside of the culture, but someone who really engages with it, but also helping to build that bridge to find some of the others who do. And one thing I don't know if they have this in Britain, but I love plugging this on the podcast, and you might enjoy hearing about this. For those who want to get a copy of the book, but like me, don't want to have to go into that place with people and things like that, supporting independent bookstores is great. But if you want to have it just brought to your house by a nice person, go to bookshop.org, because it will allow you to order the book and it will be brought to you. But instead of it going through Amazon or something else where workers are treated terribly, what the website does is just says, okay, you're in this area. There's an independent bookstore 10 miles away that has planning, and basically will just, it's just as though you did all the work of finding the independent bookstore and placing the order with them directly, so that your money goes directly to an independent bookstore. Same with like some of your older books, even ones that are out of print. Maybe a bookstore in your neighborhood doesn't have it, but maybe one 1,000 miles away does. This website will allow you to like search those inventories, find it, have it shipped to you. The money goes to a great local independent bookstore, and Jeff Bezos and his empire sees none of it. So
bookshop.org is great. We do have a version of it in Britain, and it's just wonderful. It's fantastic.
Yeah, I try to look to it all the time. I will say, and this may also improve. I got a PDF version of the book. That the images of the book are such an important part as much as the words, and which is fantastic. It meant my normal practice of reading it on my Kindle on my phone didn't work so much.
Yeah.
But like seeing, you have illustrations in there of, comics that comic strips that look like kind of anime animals interacting with a person from the 1800s. Or one of
Yes.
my favorites was a story about I guess you'd call it a manga, a comic strip that ran in a Japanese American newspaper in San Francisco called The Four
Yes.
Immigrants.
Yeah.
And you can read about it, but just seeing the images in the book. So if you can get a paper copy, or at least have an iPad or something like that. Because
Or if you've got a public library or a college library, go to your college library and ask them to buy it. That way you can read it for free and
yeah,
other people can also read it. And then it spreads the word further. I'm so glad you mentioned The Four Immigrants, because one of my personal gurus and my personal heroes, the great Frederick L. Choate,
mhm,
um, an American translator, translated that book. And thanks to him, it was publicized all over the world and published in Japan for the first time.
mm,
So that's beautiful. That's
that's
really,
wonderful.
and there's only a tiny handful in there. I could have done a whole book on
Uh-huh.
sources for manga, but there are a few
Yeah.
scholars that I think you should definitely check out. There are a few books you should definitely check out. There are websites you should check out, blogs you should check out. And the other thing is, whenever you get a book, if it's a scholarly book, it will certainly have it. Non-scholarly books sometimes have it. Go to the back and look for the bibliography or the
Yep.
list of references, because that will give you anything from 25 to several hundred more books to read, and
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful. Well, Helen, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I really hope we get to have you back. I really hope people enjoy your work. To all my fans, I would love to hear from you. When did you first encounter manga or anime? I'm guessing for a lot of us, it was in our high school or college or group of friends. Certainly, I knew an awful lot of people who first discovered it because someone they thought was cute of the gender they were interested in was interested in it. That's a great story. Write in, let us know. We'd love to hear that. So, on behalf of myself, Helen, all the people involved here, thank you all so much. May the force be with you.
Thank you and have fun.